And now I would like to let in our second speaker of today, Lissa Holloway-Attaway. Lissa is working as associate professor in media arts, aesthetics, and narration in the division of game development at the University of Skövde in Sweden. Lissa teaches within the games education, and she's the leader of the Games Art Media Experience Research Group at the university. Lissa is involved in developing projects and research at the intersections of arts, humanities, and digital technology. And she explores technological interventions in a range of cultural contexts. Lissa will today speak about making and telling interactive stories and games for and about cultural heritage. Lissa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to come to talk about this very interesting topic. And as often happens, I think Agnieszka's talk set mine up very well in terms of having some context to bring it together. So that's very helpful. I'm going to share my screen. And okay, I assume that's visible.
Yes.
For everybody. Okay, good. And I'm just going to look at time here too. Okay, so again, you've already had a bit of an introduction to me, including the name of my research group, which I'll come back to, but just as a way to suggest that although I'm in a division of game development, I don't consider myself a games researcher per se. I work across lots of different kinds of digital media and culture and traditional arts and crafts, and with a high focus on storytelling and understanding that even the games that I'm now working on or creating, or game experiences or gamified experiences, are complex and interwoven in lots of different ways. So today I'll talk a little bit about that and share some projects. But I sort of want to start with this first kind of framing quote, because as I rush through, as we have to do all the projects that I want to share, I think if we just remember sort of even this first slide that I present to you as a kind of inspiration for thinking about this, and this is where I think that Agnieszka's talk really comes through. I think this is what's important. So I'm quoting to you from one of my favorite sort of feminist philosopher theorist, Donna Haraway, in one of her recent books called Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Thulacene, and I'll come back to that. But this quote really resonates with me in terms of thinking about how we tell stories. It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, and what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. So to me, one of the reasons I find that important is because this focus on the material, and even just this first sentence, it matters what matters we use to think other matters with, suggests that the materials from which we want to tell our stories are the framing principles for how we tell them, and they change depending on whatever our material engagement is. So that even if we're working in digital worlds, which people often refer to as these virtual worlds, as though they're somehow removed from our material experiences, we have to think always of moving back and forth between those mediums and understanding that the ways that our stories are shaped come from this kind of complex moving between the digital and the physical world and the physical realm, and they might change, and the interactions are very complex that come with that. And again, Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble, suggests specifically that we're living in, well, especially we can think of today and with recent political events, but we live in troubled times. We live in times where she reflects on the fact that we live in this kind of unofficially named geological epoch called the Anthropocene, which is the age, the geological age, where we think that humans have created an impact on the world's surfacing from the level of the atmospheric to the geological, that the impact of humans on the world in which we live is very troubled. And that in order to get out of those troubles, we have to sort of stay with them and focus on them, but also think about how can we tell stories that don't just repeat the ways we've told them before, and that foreground like the human, as though the human figure is the only thing that can tell the story. We have to think through new mediums, and we have to get stuck in those knots, those twists, those embroidered threads, and think about how they can help us release into stories. So as I said, that's sort of my inspiration for thinking about that. And I think another way to think of that, what happened there? Okay. Okay, well, that's interesting. My slides went away. Let me see if I can try again. Okay. It wouldn't be a discussion about technology if the technology didn't fail. So here we go. So another way to think of that, again, drawing from Holloway, is this idea of tentacular creativity is the aim, meaning just like the tentacles of an octopus that are these multi-sensory organs that are mixing of taste and touch and smell and kind of all of these ways in which we understand the world, that the kinds of stories that I like to think of that can be engaged by technology are these sort of spread out. They don't have a core center. They don't have a human person who's narrating what's happening. They're open to thinking about how all the materials of that kind of story world can help us come together to create another kind of way of thinking. So again, I'll probably keep referencing this kind of tentacularity, but I just very briefly, just to say something more precise about, so my story that matters, where I'm coming from right now, is, as I said, at the University of Skövde, or the Högskola Skövde, and where I'm in a very large games department with 500 plus students. I think we're closer to 600 now. And at the undergraduate level, we have master's programs and all kinds of things, from serious games to game user development or game users experience, which is a new program. But this one in pink, digital narration, cultural heritage and game technologies, is where I've been teaching a lot, and where we actually are working specifically with thinking about how can we tell stories about heritage using game technologies, not necessarily specifically games or digital video games, although that's where a large portion of our people come, but how can we do it by using the technologies and the affordances of interaction and of games, and to think about new ways that we can rethink what a museum space is, or a heritage space, or intangible cultural heritage, which we come back to. But I also work, as I said, in this kind of tentacular way, where we work within business and industry and across many disciplines, from arts and literature and science to cognitive science. And so it's a very special configuration, and I feel very privileged to kind of be in a place where we don't necessarily, put the digital or the computer science over the arts and humanities, where we try to keep them intersecting so that they can inform each other and create this very sort of transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary cooperation. And I think that's key, especially if we're going to think about ways that traditional handicrafts or material crafts can be transformed by technology. We don't want to impose the technology on the sort of the inner core, the spirit of what it is we're trying to make. So often I move between these two sort of mediums. So again, another way just to think about that for a moment is to say, and I would say this is kind of a frame of some of the current research, or the ways that my research group or that my colleagues work with, going across the arts and humanities, again, where we might line up, again, these are not pure categories, but things like literature, performing arts, sound, music, graphical arts, all of those areas. And we might study them in a socio-cultural way, but also balanced by thinking about, computers and digital design tools or things that you may have heard of, like augmented reality or virtual reality or AI software platform. We might think about users as opposed to readers or viewers or anything else. And we try to put them together. And so in this middle space, I've just outlined a few ways that I have been working in terms of thinking about storytelling. So IDNs, which is just a general short form way of saying interactive digital narratives. And I'll give you examples of those. And those can include things like games, but I say games because I want us to remember that games are a very old medium. They're not necessarily computer and video games, although that's what all my students want to talk about. They go back a long time and they create bonds and social connection. Transmedia, which is a way to think about how you can tell one core story across many different platforms. So you might tell it in person with a live storytelling. It might be on a website. It might be on a phone. It might be in a blog or in a fan fiction site. But how can you distribute, again, tentacles, right? How can you distribute stories across those? But I'm really focused a lot also on MR, which is mixed reality experiences. Again, not purely going into one domain or the other, but staying in this middle ground where we really try to think about the physical and the virtual kind of coming together. Okay, so why do that? Again, it's about digital creativity and innovation, thinking about how we can materially engage with stories, so we don't, as I said, fall into one realm, but also to think about networking and sharing. You know, one of the things that digital tools do allow us to do is to create a larger network, to share what we do. And we can do this in multiple places, in schools or community sites. I work a lot in museums and at historical sites, but also in art galleries or exhibitions, formal, informal, public exhibitions in lots of different spaces or in online platforms, kind of mixing these things together. So some of the projects I'll share with you now, and as I said, I'll speed through them, unfortunately, use sort of some of this coming together. So again, at the core of this, and I won't go into detail, but just to say that I'm inspired by people like Nina Simon and her work in the Participatory Museum, where co-creation, you know, we try to create alongside the users or using multiple different people. So I might work with an archaeologist and a storyteller and a student studying games and a community person or a politician who also wants to think about that. So we want to really think about ways in which we can engage a community of people to give voice and to create a level of dialogue. So again, inspired by this idea of the museum without walls. I know we're not talking only here about museums and heritage, but I think the principle that sort of heritage is, we've transformed in terms of thinking about heritage isn't owned by a museum site who tells a story with an exhibition, but we're moving towards these audience-centered institutions, and visitors construct their own meaning. It's not told from one perspective where they're learning, and that they're finding ways to include their voices, which digital technology does very well, can also inform and invigorate the kind of the project design. Again, I won't go into this in detail. I'm happy to talk about it later, but I do focus around this idea of this kind of not just the post-digital museum, but post-digital age, which suggests that we know technologies, we're all familiar with them. We're on a Zoom site right now, even at our most basic. We don't have to keep inventing new forms of technology. What we need to think about is how can they be used? We expect them to be there now. So how can we use them in new and surprising ways that serve our purposes? So we don't focus on the technology necessarily, but we focus on the content that, you know, that can really help us embody an experience. So I also just referenced this one study from 2014 that reinforces that. It's about focused on serious games for cultural heritage. If you don't know, serious games are the kind of games that are meant not just for entertainment purposes. You might find them in, for example, a medical profession where someone's using games, or like a video game might help train a stroke patient to get back some cognitive abilities again, or a emergency management people might be using games to help train for some kind of an emergency scenario or something like that. But what they suggest is that when it comes to cultural heritage, again, the thing that's best served by games are intangible cultural heritage. That is, for example, cultural values, artistic expression, social traditions, customs. So, and this is where we're really lacking in content and where we're really open to creativity and innovation. Again, this is the affective domain, where we can feel empathy and personal expression, as opposed to just thinking again about technologies. Okay, so here is where I will just speed through some projects. So this particular project that I show you is a big storytelling project I've been involved with now for a couple of years with colleagues. It's focused on the Skaraborg region where I live. So for those of you who don't know, you can see on the map here. And if you look closely within the little purple bit there, you can see where Skövde is and how it falls. This is a very old region in Sweden with a lot of history, a lot of storytelling, folklore. Most of it, as you can see, we're between these two big lakes. And a lot of it is water-based and water creatures and so on. So our project, which is called Castis, which is in Swedish, it would translate, or in English from the Swedish, it would be cultural heritage and game technologies in the Skaraborg region. And it's a project that basically attempts to use storytelling to transform the physical space of the region into a kind of a folktale space, and to tell all the stories of the municipalities through bringing to life sort of creatures and folklore through this kind of storytelling project that we are. So what we've done is we've taken a traditional children's book series, developed one for each of the regions in the and our municipalities in the region, and tried to tell a kind of a frame narrative about these two characters who travel through the region and develop over time each of them to tell us kind of a specific story that might be, for example, if you look at some of the pictures here, you'll also notice we have a lot of sort of female water creatures that we bring to life through telling the story. And the story itself is it's a traditional children's book story, but it also uses an augmented reality application to tell that story. So and we tell the stories. So I'll show them how the augmented reality works, but we also use them not just in the children's book, but putting signage up around historical sites and landmarks that when you scan with your mobile telephone, when you scan certain characters, they come to life and pop up in the landscape, and where you can collect more information about them. So this club book, again, the two characters are Kira and Lupa. That stands for Kira and Lupa's Bestiarium. And the frame narrative is that they're chasing an evil circus director around the region who has captured many of these folkloric figures and kept them. He captured them and made them perform in his circus, and they're chasing after him, trying to release them from this kind of circus space. And it's meant for children to discover each of the characters in each of the region using the mobile phones. They scan these figures. You can see the circus director is popping up from a sea. They use their phone to scan the books. They get more information about the creature who pops out of the book. They collect it in this kind of bestiarium anthology in their phone and learn more about it. But they're also compelled to travel through the region with their parents to experience the story in sort of multiple ways. So again, they can find out their own very micro local heritage. So for example, the creature here, like on the right, like Necken, who's from a specific town called Tibro, and he plays, well, he doesn't look like it here because it's a children's book. He plays naked in the woods on his fiddle. Or we have a specific white horse that belongs to another city in the region. Or we, as I said, on site, you can travel to these various places and find figures. But we try to connect these also to a series of museum exhibitions where you can discover artifacts in the museum, where we're encouraging not just to read the books, but as I said, to go to the museums and explore some of the physical artifacts that can also pop up to you. So for example, at the bottom left, this vase, you can learn about it, you can scan figures and learn history in multiple different methods, not just in sort of in the book or in the application, but to actually physically move through the region and discover your own sort of history, or even here to go to just a physical exhibition about the books in a local library. We have board games that have developed out of this too. The board games are based on the book series. They create another intervention for students in schools or in libraries to come and play the board games, which again, these have all been developed from students and other local artists who participated with us through different iterations to keep retelling the story in these different mediums. Or for example, now we even have a tourist guidebook that's available from the tourist office using the same characters, but in a different way to continue to encourage people to travel through the region and learn the history. We have many spin-offs, and again, I'll just quickly go through, but for example, we have a spin-off book series that's based on a glass making factory in Sweden, where it's another book and another game, 2 new characters, and you can learn about how to make glass ceramics, or not glass ceramics, but how to make glass in the sort of the old way you do that by following these characters through this book and by playing little mini games about that. It's gotten quite a bit of interest when it first came out. Another project, you can see Kieran Lupa looks slightly different in this one, but how that are focused on industrial museums and telling the stories of old technologies, like here's a paper making machine. And this was in collaboration with an industrial museum in the region where kids can play the game, but also learn that, how, paper was made and the history also of the time where it was made. Or they can learn about another project, learning about landscapes, again, using augmented reality to scan images and learn about the kind of the cultural landscape, and then go out into the area. This is in Leka Castle, a little north, where you can learn about various kinds of climate challenges and other kind of global challenges, and then you can go out into the landscape and play a game with your phone with these different creatures. Again, I'll go through more, and just another project that has been taking up a lot of my space, along with partners like Magda, who's also here with me, is about how to use Minecraft, which is a popular commercial game, to also allow kids and youth to explore their own neighborhoods, recreate them using Minecraft maps that are simulations of actual neighborhoods, and then to go in and try to recreate those neighborhoods in playful settings and in workshops to learn about the heritage, but also just to express how they see their history. We don't tell them how to see the history, but how do they understand their heritage? So that, for example, in Karlskrona in Sweden, we can work with the Naval Museum, which was one of our partners, and to host a series of workshops there where we brought together kids and asked them, to think about, what does heritage mean to you? What are your stories? What stories can you tell? And how can you do this by rebuilding? So they would sometimes rebuild monuments, but they would also sometimes just add in new features into the landscape so that we could learn a little more about, how they saw their worlds and what they did. So this was a long project. Sometimes they give you things you don't expect to see, like we tell them to build heritage, but they wanted to build a McDonald's. But it also tells us a little bit more about how they see their spaces. And again, this was a big project in partnership with people. For example, we had workshops in Riga, in Latvia, new kinds of games and new workshops that were in Gdansk in Poland, also in Kiel in Germany. So again, through a long process of kind of playful storytelling and material interaction in both the physical space, but also in the virtual spaces, we sort of bring people together to think about how play can create a network of experience to help us let stories emerge about what might be hidden or intangible or underneath the surface.